Grave of his father Janos, who was buried the day before, and the grave of Joseph's mother Catalina, who died a year ago, was also nearby. The young boy Joseph was crying near the fresh grave of his father Janos, who was buried the day before. The whole village felt sorry for the guy who managed to lose his parents in a year. Catalina began to wither from an unknown disease. The doctors just shrugged their hands. They could not explain such a rapid deterioration in the woman's health. Joseph, on the other hand, believed that his mother had undermined her health by spending around the clock around her sick husband and caring for him. She could not sleep for several nights in a row. This woman sacrificed herself, trying to help her long-ill husband. Janos fell ill with consumption after participating against the uprising of Choria, Kloshka, and Krishan. His condition worsened from time to time. His mother took care of him every time. During the last exacerbation, which was the most acute and severe, the wife diligently cared for her husband and did everything she could. Janos did not let her go from him, as if even her mere presence next to him gave him strength. Katerina could not do the housework. All these troubles were taken over by Joseph. As soon as Catalina was away for more than half an hour, he would throw a tantrum, he would have a seizure, and Catalina would return to the patient's bed in horror. So she sat by his bed, and her father really got better. The seizures stopped, he had an appetite, a blush on his cheeks, his breathing became light and clear. The same could not be said about his wife. It was this last time that she began to lose her health. By the time Father Joseph fully recovered from the illness, Catalina, on the contrary, fell ill and did not get up again. Joseph suffered the loss of his mother hard, and Janos did not show any feelings. He was a tough man, with a tough and strict character, did not tolerate any bickering. The villagers did not like him for his terrible character. It seemed that he hated everyone and everyone on this earth. Joseph revered and respected his father, and at the same time was afraid of him to the point of trembling. It was necessary for the son to express at least the slightest disobedience, to make at least a small mistake. The father always had a rod ready. After the death of his mother, about 6 months later, the disease worsened again, and now Joseph had to sit and take care of his father. How hard it was for Joseph. He was torn between farming and caring for his father, and after all, it was also necessary to earn his daily bread. The family had little land, a very small plot, and therefore the father and son worked as farmhands. But even that was impossible now. The time of harvest was approaching. If it was not harvested, then there would be nothing to pay tithes with, and there would be nothing to eat ourselves. Joseph was terribly nervous about this. Every day he was afraid that the harvest would be ruined by hail, rain, or someone would steal it. That is why, in order to preserve it, Joseph one day, as soon as his father fell asleep, went to the family's lands and harvested. Returning home with a calm soul, Joseph did not expect to find his father dead. It was noticeable that the man was tossing in agony, tearing the bed and pillow. A grimace of pain and anger froze on his face. And now, standing at his father's fresh grave, Joseph blamed himself for everything. At night, heavy thoughts and guilt kept Joseph awake. In the silence of the night, there was a knock on the window. Joseph looked out the window and saw his father, who was dressed in his favorite clothes. "Joseph, let me in. I'm tired and weak, feed me dinner," Janos said in his strict manner. Joseph was overcome with fear. He could not believe his eyes. Had his father returned? The young man let his father into the house. Guilt and grief kept him from thinking straight, and besides, he was still afraid of his father. Janos went into the house and sat down at the table. Joseph immediately handed his father a plate of soup and a mug of milk, sat down himself at the opposite end of the table and was afraid to look at his stern father. "What? You know it's my fault. Why did you leave me alone? Your mother never did that." The father spoke sternly. "I'm sorry, father, I didn't know this would happen. I wanted to harvest." "Harvest? Okay, tell me, what do you have here?" Joseph had nothing to tell his father. What could have happened in 3 days? But the father began to tell about Catalina, whom he allegedly met, and that she was also angry with her son for such irresponsible behavior that led to the tragedy. Joseph listened and was afraid to speak. The more his father talked, the more Joseph wanted to sleep. His eyes closed against his will, and the guy did not notice how he fell asleep right at the table. In the morning, Joseph woke up with a terrible headache and felt overwhelmed. He abruptly got up from the stool, remembering yesterday's arrival of his father. There was still a plate of untouched soup and a full mug of milk on the table. All the food had gone sour. So it didn't seem like it, so the father really came. But Joseph decided not to tell anyone anything, and began to wait for nightfall and the arrival of his father. And the father came. He again asked for dinner and told about Joseph's mother that she gives her son the most tender hugs and kisses and is waiting for them both. And again, Joseph did not notice how he fell asleep. Such visits became nightly. The guy rejoiced and waited for the arrival of his father. His sense of grief and pain passed, but his physical condition worsened every day. He practically stopped leaving the house. The neighbors noticed that Joseph had not appeared for a long time, and decided to go and visit him, because he was left all alone. And in such a grief, you can do a lot of bad things. Joseph opened the door, and the neighbors were frightened by his sickly appearance, pale skin, bruises under his eyes, terrible thinness. It seemed that the guy was not 20 years old, but all 90. The guy answered all their questions that everything was fine with him and smiled. But the residents did not leave it all just like that. They brought a doctor to Joseph. He did not find any diseases or reasons why the guy's condition would worsen. Rumors spread around the village. It was necessary to find out the reason for this condition of the guy, and decided to follow his house. And at night, they saw a silhouette approaching Joseph's house from the cemetery. The man came to the door and Joseph let him in. The bravest of the watchers cautiously moved towards the house and looked through the window. In the dim candlelight, they saw Joseph sitting at the table, and opposite him, Yonos, his father. So that's why the guy fades so much. His father is a vampire and comes to his son, feeding on his vital energy. The whole village discussed this event the next day, and many decided that this Yonos and his wife were so exhausted, only while still alive. But it was necessary to do something, otherwise after his son he would take on other villagers and might kill them all. This happened in neighboring villages. Many residents died until they dealt with the vampire. The strongest men went to the cemetery and dug up Yonos' grave. When they opened the coffin, they saw that the body did not even begin to decompose, and the deceased began to look even better than when he was alive. Wrinkles smoothed out, a blush appeared on his cheeks, even grey hair began to disappear. Without thinking twice, they drove a stake into the chest of the ghoul and cut off his head, putting it at the feet of the deceased. Then they buried the grave, sprinkled holy water and poured salt. After all these procedures, the father stopped coming to Joseph. At first, the guy was very upset, but soon his bitterness of loss passed. He himself went on the mend, began to gain strength and even matured. And 6 months later he married a charming girl, Agnes. They had children and their house was filled with love and happiness. Joseph did not become the same father as Yonos. He did not punish the children and was not strict with them, and Agnes said that he would spoil them so much. To all these words, Joseph just smiled, hugged his wife and children and kissed them.